We often hear a simple claim: religious people are more charitable, they give more, they volunteer more, they care more about others. At first glance, that sounds like a clear moral victory. If faith makes people more generous, maybe it's doing something right. But is that really true? Or is there a story beneath the surface that we rarely question? The truth isn't as straightforward as it's often presented. Because when we talk about charity, we're not just talking about how many dollars go into a collection plate. We're talking about intention, about impact, and about who actually benefits from those donations. On paper, religious people in many countries do give more on average than those who don't belong to a faith. That statistic is quoted everywhere, in news articles, sermons, even political speeches. But the problem is that number comes with an asterisk the size of a billboard, because most of that money doesn't go where you might think. It doesn't always feed the hungry or shelter the homeless. A huge portion stays inside the walls of the very institutions collecting it. Think about it. When a church asks for tithes, where does that money go? It pays for the building, for salaries, for programs aimed at spreading that same belief. It funds religious schools, mission trips, and sometimes enormous marketing campaigns. Is that charity, or is that maintenance of an organization's existence? If most of what's called charitable giving never leaves the faith's ecosystem, can we really call it altruism? Here's what research shows. In the United States, for example, studies reveal that nearly 70% of religious donations go to congregations or faith-based institutions. These are classified as charitable organizations under tax law, but their primary mission isn't always humanitarian relief. Often it's spiritual services. Compare that with secular donors who typically give to hospitals, education programs, scientific research, or direct aid to those in need. The difference is not just about the amount, it's about the purpose. Now, let's ask the hard question. When someone gives to their church, are they helping others out of compassion? Or are they fulfilling an obligation, following a rule, or seeking divine favor? It matters. Because charity motivated by fear of punishment or promise of reward isn't exactly the same as charity born from empathy. One is transactional, an exchange with the divine. The other comes from recognizing the suffering of another human being and wanting to ease it, no strings attached. Psychologists have studied this for decades. There's a concept called extrinsic religiosity. When someone practices faith mainly for social approval or fear of consequences. People high in extrinsic religiosity often donate because it's expected, not because they care deeply about the cause. In contrast, intrinsic religiosity, faith as a personal moral compass, tends to predict more genuine giving. But even then, the giving is usually filtered through the institution that shaped those values. Which brings us back to the same loop. If the money mostly circulates within that system, can we really call that a net good for society? This raises another question we rarely hear in these discussions. Why do so many people assume religion has a monopoly on kindness? It's a cultural reflex, not a fact. Empathy isn't handed down from a pulpit, it's part of being human. Long before formal religions existed, hunter-gatherer groups survived because they cared for the sick and shared resources. Archaeologists have found skeletons with healed injuries that would have been fatal without group support. Cooperation isn't a divine invention, it's an evolutionary advantage. Yet religion often claims credit for something far older and more universal, our social instincts. When surveys report that religious people volunteer more, we need to look closely. Most of that volunteering happens inside their own communities, teaching Sunday school, running church events, organizing services. Again, these are community-building activities, not necessarily efforts that reduce suffering for strangers. It's good for group cohesion, but that's different from solving hunger or disease. Now, none of this means religious giving has no positive impact. Churches do run food banks, shelters, disaster relief. Many do good work on the ground, but the scale of that work is often overstated. For example, in the US, estimates suggest that less than 5% of religious donations go to services that primarily help people outside the congregation. 5%. That's not the headline you hear when someone says, religious people give more. And let's not forget the cost of conditional charity. When aid is tied to conversion, when food is given alongside a sermon, is that pure generosity? Or is it marketing disguised as compassion? There are countless stories of communities receiving disaster relief only if they attend prayer meetings, or children getting access to education through missionary schools that demand adherence to a faith that's not just charity, it's leverage. It uses vulnerability as an opening for influence, and if that feels uncomfortable, it should. What's more, religion doesn't just encourage giving, it often controls it by directing it to causes that align with its doctrine rather than evidence-based solutions. While secular nonprofits increasingly measure impact, track outcomes, and publish data, many religious organizations operate with minimal transparency. Money flows toward evangelism rather than systemic change, toward symbolism rather than substance. So, does faith make people more charitable? If we define charity as maintaining the walls of an institution, then maybe. But if we define it as reducing suffering, promoting education, improving health, and empowering lives without strings attached, the picture changes dramatically, and the more we examine it, the more we realize generosity isn't owned by religion, and never was. There's another layer to this conversation, the psychological reward system behind giving. Neuroscience has shown that donating to charity activates the brain's pleasure centers, the same areas linked to food and social bonding. In other words, giving feels good, and that's true regardless of belief. But in many religious contexts, this natural reward is amplified by spiritual incentives. You're told that giving pleases God, earns blessings, maybe even guarantees eternal life. That creates a powerful psychological feedback loop. Give more, feel more virtuous, secure your place in paradise. Contrast that with secular giving. There's no cosmic scoreboard, no promise of an afterlife boost, just the simple recognition that someone else needs help, and you can do something about it. From an ethical standpoint, that difference matters. One kind of generosity is rooted in reality, the actual suffering of another person. The other can sometimes feel like an investment in a metaphysical savings account. This leads to a tough question. If a person gives because they fear divine punishment, is that morality or self-preservation? If they give because their community expects it, is that compassion or conformity? Motivation doesn't just color the act, it defines its moral weight. Philosopher Immanuel Kant argued that actions only have true moral worth when done from duty, not from self-interest. If we extend that logic, charity given for heavenly rewards is morally shallow compared to charity given with no strings attached. Now let's zoom out to the bigger picture. Global data on generosity shows an interesting trend. Countries with higher levels of secularization, like those in Scandinavia, consistently rank among the most charitable in terms of international aid, humanitarian relief, and social welfare spending. These societies tax themselves heavily to provide universal healthcare, education, and robust safety nets. That's charity scaled up into policy. It's not voluntary in the traditional sense, but it reflects a collective commitment to human well-being. And here's the key, these countries also tend to have the lowest levels of religious belief. So if religion were the engine of generosity, we'd expect the opposite pattern. We'd expect the most devout nations to have the strongest social systems. But often, the reverse is true. Highly religious countries frequently have weaker safety nets, higher inequality, and greater reliance on private charity, which often comes with the conditions we mentioned earlier. Meanwhile, the least religious societies have baked compassion into their laws, ensuring help isn't dependent on which God you worship. Of course, defenders of religious charity will point to organizations like Catholic Relief Services or Islamic Relief Worldwide, and yes, these do significant humanitarian work. But here's the nuance. Even these groups often operate with religious framing, using aid as a vehicle for influence. And they still represent a small fraction of the enormous sums flowing into religious coffers globally. For every dollar spent on global hunger, far more is spent on ornate buildings, ceremonial rituals, and proselytizing campaigns. And then there's the issue of efficiency. When donations pass through religious structures, a chunk is lost to overhead, not just administrative costs, but symbolic ones. Mega-churches with multi-million-dollar sound systems, televangelists with private jets, mosques and temples with lavish interiors. These aren't abstract expenses, they come straight from funds labeled as charity on tax forms. Meanwhile, evidence-based secular charities like GiveWell, top-rated organizations, can literally save a child's life from malaria for about $5. $5. What could happen if even a fraction of the billions spent on institutional religion were redirected to interventions with proven impact? And that brings us to transparency. Secular nonprofits are usually required to publish detailed financial reports, outcome metrics, and audits. Many even undergo independent evaluations to ensure accountability. Religious organizations? Often exempt? In countries like the US, churches don't have to file the same level of disclosure as other nonprofits. That means donors rarely know how much goes to actual aid versus internal spending. So when statistics claim religious people give more, what we really know is they transfer more money into opaque systems. That's not the same as generosity in action. But let's pause and ask, why does this myth persist? Why does the idea that faith equals compassion remain so culturally entrenched? Partly because it serves the narrative of religion as a moral compass. If people believe the alternative is moral chaos, they're less likely to question the system. It's also a comforting story, the notion that devotion produces goodness, that communities of faith hold society together. But reality is more complex. Studies on secular morality consistently show that non-religious individuals score just as high, sometimes higher, on measures of empathy, fairness, and pro-social behavior. And when giving does differ, it often reflects income levels, political ideology, or cultural norms, not just belief in a deity. So what happens when belief fades? Do people stop giving? The evidence says no. In fact, in some cases, they give more effectively, because when morality isn't outsourced to divine command, people start thinking critically about where their help does the most good. That's the foundation of movements like effective altruism, grounded not in scripture, but in reason and data. And while it has its own debates, it points to a deeper truth. Compassion doesn't need a supernatural origin story. It just needs an honest look at reality. There's another angle we need to look at: historical context. For centuries, religious institutions were the main channels for charity because they controlled wealth and influence. In medieval Europe, for example, monasteries provided alms, hospitals, and care for the poor. But why? Because the church owned massive landholdings and collected tithes. Effectively functioning as both landlord and tax authority, helping the poor wasn't just a spiritual duty, it was a way to stabilize society and protect the institution's power. When you control resources, offering relief isn't pure altruism, it's governance. Fast forward to today, and much of that legacy remains. Religious charities still dominate in many regions, but often because secular infrastructure is underfunded. When governments fail to provide basic services, churches step in, and then claim moral superiority for doing so. But that's not proof that faith inherently makes people generous. It's proof that private charity fills the gaps left by broken systems. In fact, in societies with strong public welfare, religious giving often declines. Why? Because the need isn't as visible, and because collective responsibility takes over from individual obligation. This raises an uncomfortable truth. In many cases, religious giving thrives on poverty. It relies on suffering to justify its role. A world without desperation would make missionary work unnecessary. That's not to say religious people want suffering to continue, but the structure of faith-based charity often perpetuates dependency instead of solving root causes. When donations go to food parcels instead of policy change, the cycle repeats, and for institutions that cycle is useful, keeps people coming back for help and for faith. Another layer is the moral framing around giving. In many religious traditions, generosity is not optional, it's commanded. In Islam, there's zakat. In Christianity, tithing. In Hinduism, dan. These obligations can encourage helpful behavior, but they also remove the element of choice. And choice matters. When you give freely, you're exercising empathy. When you give because you're told it's a sin not to, that's compliance. It's like paying a spiritual tax. And as with any tax, people often look for ways to minimize it or justify it. Which is why so much religious giving stays internal. It satisfies the rule without stretching the comfort zone. Now consider how this looks in practice. A person donates 10% of their income to their church every month. They feel generous. But if 90 cents of every dollar funds worship services, building maintenance, and clergy salaries, how much is really reaching the vulnerable? Meanwhile, that same person might decline to support a secular charity fighting malaria because it doesn't align with their spiritual priorities. Though on paper they're more charitable, but in real-world impact the picture is far less flattering. Let's talk numbers for a moment. In the US, churches collectively take in hundreds of billions of dollars annually. If even half of that went to global health initiatives, we could virtually eliminate several preventable diseases. Instead, the bulk supports local congregational life. That's not evil, people need community, but let's stop pretending it's the same as curing hunger or ending illiteracy. When you peel back the labels, much of what gets counted as charity is really community spending dressed up as moral virtue. There's also the question of how religion shapes who gets help. Many faith-based charities prioritize those who share their beliefs, sometimes subtly, sometimes openly, whether it's proselytizing in exchange for aid or focusing programs in religious majority areas. These choices can leave entire populations underserved. Contrast that with secular organizations which, at least in principle, operate without regard to creed. If the goal is universal human welfare, then impartiality matters. And yet, in the realm of charity, impartiality is often sacrificed on the altar of doctrine. Let's not ignore the darker side, the use of charity as a tool for conversion. History is filled with examples. Missionaries offering food and medicine in exchange for baptism, aid groups handing out Bibles alongside disaster relief, schools teaching literacy through scripture. In moments of crisis, people are vulnerable. Linking survival to faith is not generosity, it's coercion dressed as kindness. And while defenders call it saving souls, the ethical cost is enormous. When someone accepts your belief system under duress, is that faith or is it survival instinct at work? At this point, someone might say, but at least they're doing something. Better to feed the hungry with conditions than not at all. It's a tempting argument, but it misses the long game. Conditional aid can destabilize communities, erode trust, and replace local traditions with dependency on foreign institutions. It turns charity into cultural colonization. And often, the people making these trade-offs aren't the ones bearing the consequences. They're sitting thousands of miles away, writing checks and feeling virtuous. Why does the myth persist that religion makes people more charitable? Part of the answer lies in how generosity is measured. Surveys often rely on self-reporting. Did you donate to charity this year? If someone gives to their church, that counts. But if another person gives time mentoring kids or helping a neighbor without going through a formal organization, it often doesn't. So the data skews toward religious people because their giving is institutionalized and easy to track. The result? Headlines that oversimplify a messy reality. Media plays a role too. Stories about faith-driven kindness make for compelling narratives. They fit the cultural script. Religion equals virtue. It's comforting and it sells. Politicians love it as well because it supports policies that funnel resources toward faith-based programs. After all, if religious groups are the moral backbone of society, why not empower them with funding? But this framing has consequences. It reinforces the idea that morality is inseparable from belief, leaving little space for secular ethics in public discourse. Then there's social signaling. Giving within a religious context isn't just about helping others, it's about identity. In many congregations, donations are public, or at least visible to leadership. That creates social pressure to give. People want to be seen as devout, generous, trustworthy. It's human nature. But when giving becomes a badge of belonging, it stops being purely altruistic. It's tied to reputation. And while that may keep the money flowing, it complicates the narrative of selfless love. Contrast this with secular giving, which often lacks those built-in incentives. There's no weekly gathering where everyone watches the donation plate, no promise of eternal reward for clicking Donate Now on a website. This means secular donors tend to be motivated by impact, not optics. They're asking, where will my money do the most good? That mindset has fueled a shift toward evidence-based philanthropy. Groups like GiveWell, The Life You Can Save, and Effective Altruism. These movements analyze interventions using rigorous data, cost per life saved, long-term effects, transparency. It's not as glamorous as building a cathedral, but it changes lives in measurable ways. Now, let's ground this in real-world examples. In 2010, a cholera outbreak struck Haiti. Dozens of faith-based groups rushed in with aid, but many prioritized distributing Bibles alongside food and water. Some refused to partner with local secular agencies because of moral differences over contraception or LGBTQ rights. Meanwhile, secular NGOs focused solely on sanitation, clean water, and medical treatment. Which approach saved more lives? It wasn't the one handing out religious tracts. Or consider disaster relief in the wake of the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. Evangelical organizations spent millions not only on emergency aid but on evangelism in devastated communities. Survivors received help, but they also endured pressure to convert. The line between compassion and opportunism blurred completely. These aren't isolated incidents. They reflect a pattern where charity becomes a vehicle for ideology. And yet, despite these ethical red flags, faith-based charities continue to enjoy enormous trust. Why? Because people conflate intent with outcome. They see the smiling volunteers, the food drives, the heartfelt appeals. What they don't see are the opportunity costs. The programs never funded, the systemic changes never pursued because energy went into proselytizing instead. And make no mistake, outcomes matter. If the goal is to reduce suffering, then how much good we achieve per dollar should be the yardstick, not how warm the act makes us feel, and certainly not whether it pleases a deity. There's a philosophical layer here too. When generosity is tied to eternal reward, is it still generosity? Or is it a transaction disguised as virtue? Think of Pascal's wager, the famous argument that it's rational to believe in God because the payoff is infinite. If someone applies that same logic to giving, I'll donate now for heavenly interest later, we're not looking at selflessness, we're looking at cosmic insurance. True compassion doesn't calculate. It doesn't ask, what's in it for me in this life or the next? It simply responds to need. This brings us to something uncomfortable. Maybe the question isn't whether religious people give more. Maybe it's whether they give better. Because giving isn't inherently good, it depends on what it supports. Funding anti-science campaigns, conversion drives, or discrimination under the banner of charity isn't progress. It's harm wearing a halo. And until we start measuring charity by its real-world impact rather than its theological branding, we'll keep mistaking noise for substance. Let's talk about something that often gets lost in these debates. Compassion isn't owned by any creed, it's not a religious patent. It's a human trait deeply wired into our biology. We evolved as social creatures because cooperation increased our chances of survival. Neuroscientists call it the empathy network. Brain systems that light up when we witness another person's pain. That response exists in believers and non-believers alike. It's not a miracle, it's a mechanism, and it works without divine supervision. When we strip away the layers of dogma, what's left is simple. People help because they care, or because they've been conditioned to think they should. The difference matters. Compassion driven by genuine concern can adapt to evidence. It can ask, what works best? How can I make the most difference? Compassion tethered to doctrine can't always do that. It's limited by rules written centuries ago, by priorities that don't always align with modern reality. That's why faith-based giving sometimes resists funding things like contraception or HIV prevention, even when these save lives. Doctrine doesn't bend easily, even when logic demands it. This is where secular ethics offers something powerful. It doesn't start with commandments, it starts with consequences. If an action reduces harm and increases well-being, it's good. If it doesn't, it's not. That framework makes giving not just a moral impulse, but a rational strategy. It turns charity from a ritual into a science. And when we apply that lens, something becomes clear. $1 spent on malaria nets saves more lives than $1 spent on marble altars. A day volunteering at a food bank matters more than a day organizing a sermon against same-sex marriage. These aren't abstract points. They're life and death realities. But maybe the most hopeful thing in all of this is that generosity without gods is not only possible, it's thriving. Look at secular humanitarian groups operating in war zones. Look at global crowdfunding efforts for disaster victims, where donors come from every worldview imaginable. Look at movements like effective altruism, which challenge us to do good better, not for eternal reward, but because suffering exists and we can reduce it. That's morality without myth, and it works. So where does that leave us with the question, do religious people give more to charity? On paper, maybe, but once we follow the money, once we examine intent and impact, the halo starts to slip. Much of what counts as charity in religious contexts is maintenance of community, not transformation of the world. And that's okay if we're honest about it. The problem is when we mistake insularity for altruism or assume belief is the engine of benevolence. It's not. The engine is empathy, and that belongs to everyone. There's a quote by philosopher Peter Singer that sums this up beautifully. If it is in our power to prevent something bad from happening without sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought to do it. Notice what's missing. No mention of heaven, sin, or divine mandate. Just a simple principle grounded in reason and shared humanity. That idea has saved more lives than any sermon ever could, because it asks us to give not for reward, not out of fear, but because the suffering of others matters and we have the power to help. And maybe that's the real truth hiding behind the myth. Generosity isn't sacred, it's practical, it's urgent, and it's ours. The more we free it from superstition, the more good it can do. Because when charity stops serving belief and starts serving humanity, everyone wins. And that's something worth believing in.